The first thing Marta noticed was the smell. Not smoke, not cold, not the sharp metallic bite of a Kansas January pressing through every crack in the walls. What she noticed, stepping down those 7 uneven earthen steps on a morning when the thermometer outside read 11 degrees Fahrenheit, was warmth. Quiet, still, patient warmth. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that had simply been waiting there all night, keeping itself. She set the lantern on the shelf her father had cut from the clay wall. The light touched the hanging onions, the crocks of lard, the wooden crate of potatoes her father had carried down in October. None of it had frozen. None of it had even come close. Outside, the wind was crossing the open plain at what she guessed was 30 miles an hour. 3 families along the ridge road had already lost their root vegetables to the hard freeze that had come 2 weeks early. Lars Henriksen had lost half a barrel of salted pork when the brine cracked his container overnight. Agnes Brower was feeding her children boiled wheat and not much else. Marta pulled her coat tighter out of habit, then realized she didn't need it. She let go of the collar. The room her father had built was 11 feet wide, 9 feet deep, and just tall enough that she did not have a duck to move through it. The walls were not timber. They were not stone. They were the earth itself, shaped and packed and understood. Her father had not built a room. He had convinced the ground to hold one. She had told him he was wrong. So had everyone else. She picked up one of the potatoes, turned it in her hand. Firm, cool but not cold. The way a potato is supposed to feel in November, not January. She heard his boots on the steps behind her. He came down without a lantern. He knew the room well enough by then to move through it in the dark. He stood beside her for a moment, said nothing, looked at the same potato in her hand. Then he opened the notebook. If you have ever wondered how a man with no money, no machinery, and no approval from anyone around him managed to build something that outlasted every prediction made against it, stay with this story. Because what Elias Voss did in the winter of 1887 was not clever. It was patient. And patience, it turned out, was the one thing the Kansas ground had in abundance. If this kind of frontier wisdom matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories alive. The parcel had been listed for 2 years before Elias Voss arrived. That was not because it was remote. Most of the land in that part of Kansas was remote. It was because the lot had earned a reputation that traveled faster than any advertisement. The soil on the lower half of the parcel was a heavy clay mix that drained poorly, cracked in summer, and swelled like bread dough after rain. The upper portion sat on a slight rise that caught wind from 3 directions. There was no stream, no well already dug, and no shade older than 8 years. Elias paid $63 for all of it. He arrived with a daughter, a wagon, 3 crates of tools, and a notebook he had carried from Westphalia 11 years earlier. He spoke careful English, the kind learned from books rather than conversation, and he asked questions in a way that made people pause before answering, not because his questions were difficult, but because they were precise. He would ask not where the nearest water was, but how far down the water table sat in August versus February. He would ask not whether the land flooded, but where the water went when it left. The neighbors answered as best they could, and then returned to their own work, already forming quiet opinions about the German who had bought the lot no one else wanted. Lars Henriksen lived a half-mile north, and had farmed that land for 9 years. He had built a proper timber frame house, a serviceable barn, and a root cellar that functioned well enough in ordinary winters. He was not a cruel man, but he had a certainty about him that came from having survived long enough in Kansas to believe he understood what the land would and would not permit. When he rode past the Voss parcel in August and saw Elias walking the low ground with a long stick, pressing it into the clay at intervals and noting something in the notebook, Lars slowed his horse but did not stop. He watched for a moment, then continued on. That evening he told his wife that the Germans seemed to be measuring the wrong things. The first structure Elias built was a simple above-ground kitchen addition to the temporary shelter he had thrown up on arrival. He built it in late August, working mostly at night and on Sundays. It was small and serviceable, with a good iron stove he had brought from a wagon. The first serious freeze came in early November. The kitchen addition cracked along the north wall by the second week. The clay soil beneath the foundation had absorbed moisture during the fall rains, and then expanded when the temperature dropped. The floor lifted unevenly. The stove sat at an angle by December. Before Christmas, Elias had disassembled the stove and moved it back into the main shelter. He sat at the table that night with the notebook open in front of him. Marta watched him from across the room. She was 16, practical, and had inherited her father's habit of saying less than she was thinking. What she was thinking was that Lars Henriksen had tried to warn them gently in October. What she did not say was that she had begun to agree with him. Her father did not look defeated. He looked interested. He wrote 3 lines in the notebook, closed it, and went asleep. The Kansas ground had just taught him its first lesson. He had paid attention. February arrived in a way that old settlers described as personal. It was not simply cold. It was cold with intention, the kind of cold that found gaps in timber, turned moisture to weight, and pressed against everything that had been built with the assumption that a wall was enough. Elias spent that February watching rather than reacting. He walked the property each morning before full light. He carried the notebook and a piece of thin copper wire he used as a probe, pressing it into ground at different points and different depths, then holding it against the back of his hand to feel the temperature difference. It was not a scientific instrument. It was barely an instrument at all. But over 3 weeks, it told him something consistent and strange. At the surface, the ground was frozen to a depth of roughly 14 inches in the coldest stretches. Below that, the clay remained workable. Below 2 feet, it held what he began to call in the notebook a remembered temperature. Not warm exactly, but not frozen. Stable. He had seen this before, or something close to it. In Westphalia, in his father's time, root storage pits had been dug into hillsides not simply to hide food from the cold, but to place it inside a layer of earth that the frost could not fully reach. The men who built those pits had not used the word thermal mass. They had used the word sense, as in it makes sense that the deep ground doesn't freeze, because if it did, the seeds would die and there would be no spring. Elias wrote 4 pages in the notebook that February. Sketches, mostly. Cross-sections of the low ground, with depth measurements and temperature estimates. He noted where the clay changed consistency, where the subsoil showed traces of organic material, where the ground stayed slightly damp even in the worst cold. Not from frost, but from a stable moisture the freeze could not reach. Marta found him one morning crouched at the base of the low slope, pressing both hands flat against the earth. She stood at a distance for a moment, watching. He did not look up. She said, finally, that breakfast was ready. He said he would come in a minute. He did not come in for another half hour. When he did, he sat down, ate without speaking, and then opened the notebook and added a measurement she had not seen him take. She looked at it sideways. It read, 31 inches, stable, below the line. She did not ask what the line was. She would understand it before autumn, what Elias had begun to map. Through weeks of observation, and a tool no more sophisticated than a piece of wire in his own skin, was the frost boundary. Not the average boundary described in agricultural almanacs, but the specific boundary on his specific parcel in a specific type of clay, in a winter that was harder than most. He had found the place the cold could not reach. The question now was whether he could build something there. He started digging in late April, when the frost had retreated and the clay had softened enough to cut with a spade. The location he chose was the low slope on the north side of the property, below the small rise that caught the wind. It was not where he would have preferred to build. It was where the ground had told him to build. The clay there was dense, consistent, and layered in a way that suggested it had been compacted by water over a long time. It would hold shape. It would also, he believed, hold temperature. He marked a rectangle 11 feet by 9 feet into the hillside and began. He worked mornings and evenings, not midday. The work was slow. Clay is not soil. It does not give the way topsoil does. It has to be cut and lifted in sections, and when it dries on a spade it bonds like low-quality cement. His hands blistered in the first week, which he found notable given that he had spent 30 years at a forge. Marta helped when she could, which was most mornings before the household work demanded her elsewhere. She did not complain, but she said little, which for her was the same thing. The road ran near enough that passing wagons could see the excavation clearly. By the second week, it had become something people slowed down to observe. Pastor Gruffeld stopped one afternoon, climbed down from his wagon, and walked to the edge of the excavation with his hands clasped behind his back. He looked in for a long moment. He asked Elias, with genuine if clumsy kindness, whether everything was all right, whether the family needed anything. Elias said they were fine, thank you, and kept digging. The pastor looked at the hole for another moment, then back at Elias. He said it was a good, deep hole. He said it in the way a man says something when he cannot think of anything else to say. 2 days later, Lars Henriksen came. He did not climb down from the wagon. He looked at the excavation from the road, looked at Elias, then looked again at the excavation. His expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a man reviewing a calculation he has already completed. He said that clay walls needed support, that unsupported clay walls in wet ground slumped. He said this had happened to the Brenner family 4 years back, when they tried something similar, and that the structure had collapsed in the spring thaw and taken a corner of their barn with it. He paused. He said that he hoped the German knew what he was doing, and that his daughter was a nice girl, and that he did not want to see them hurt. Then he drove on. Marta had been standing 6 feet behind her father during this exchange. She had heard every word. She waited until the wagon was out of sight before she spoke. She asked her father whether Lars was right about the clay. Elias kept digging for 3 strokes of the spade before he answered. He said Lars was right that unsupported clay collapsed. He said that was why he was not going to leave it unsupported. She asked what he was going to use for support. He set down the spade, picked up the notebook, and showed her a drawing she had not seen before. It was not timber framing. It was not stone. It was a clay itself, shaped and layered and packed in a way she did not immediately understand. He said the wall would hold because of what he was going to put inside it, not what he was going to put against it. She looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she picked up her spade and went back to work. By September, the main excavation was finished, and the walls had been cut back to their intended angle. Elias had shaped the entry as a descending passage. 7 steps cut into the clay, wide enough for 2 people side by side. The ceiling of the chamber was the earth itself, reinforced at the crown with a layer of packed clay and dry grass he had tamped down from the surface above. The floor he left as native clay, packed hard with a wooden mallet over 3 days. He moved the iron stove in during the last week of September, 1 piece at a time, and reassembled it at the back of the chamber. He ran the flue pipe at a low angle through the back wall, and up through a short chimney stub he had formed from clay and straw on the slope above. By early October, the room smelled of earth and iron, and the first small fires he had lit to test a draw. The draw was imperfect. Smoke backed into the room in the first few tests, and he spent 2 evenings adjusting the flue angle before it cleared reliably. He had told no one the structure was complete, but in a community where farmsteads are visible from a road and the smoke from a new chimney is noticed, privacy is a negotiation. The autumn rains arrived the 3rd week of October. Heavy, sustained, the kind that filled every low point on the property with standing water By the second day, on the fourth day of rain, the northeast corner of the chamber moved. It did not collapse, but it shifted. A section of the wall approximately 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall developed a crack that ran diagonally from near the ceiling to floor, and clay on the outer face of that section bowed inward by what Elias measured at nearly 2 inches. He stood in the chamber for a long time, looking at it. Marta came down the steps and stood beside him. She looked at the crack, then at her father. He said nothing for several minutes. Then he took out the notebook and began sketching the section of wall, marking where the crack originated, the angle of the bow, the approximate depth at which the shift had occurred. She asked him whether it was over. He did not answer right away. He ran his hand along the face of the crack, pressed his fingers into it, pulled them back. He looked at what had come with them. Not wet clay, dry clay that had broken along the structural line, which meant the moisture from the rain had not yet penetrated the full depth of the wall, which meant the wall had failed at the surface, not at its core. He said it was not over. He said it was showing him something. She said she was not sure that was helpful right now. He said it was the most helpful thing that had happened in 3 months. Lars Henriksen did not come by that week, but a boy from a Henriksen farm passed on the road 2 days later and reported what he had seen, and by the following Sunday the information had completed its circuit through the community. Elias had heard it come back to him secondhand by Tuesday, delivered without malice by Agnes Brower, who had the rare quality of being honest without being unkind. She said that people were saying the underground kitchen had not worked. Elias told her it had not worked yet. He said there was a difference. She looked at him for a moment, then nodded, and went back to her own work. He went back to his notebook. The rebuild took 6 weeks. The failed corner taught him what he had not yet understood about the clay on that parcel. The outer layer, exposed to the moisture gradient between the wet surface and the drier interior, had dried unevenly and then rehydrated too fast when the rains came. The crack was not a structural failure of the clay's strength. It was a failure of his understanding of how the clay breathed. He had treated the wall as a single material. It was not. It was 3 materials behaving differently at 3 depths. He began pulling the failed section back to a point approximately 14 inches from the outer face, where the clay was still dense and consistent. He rebuilt in layers, alternating between compacted clay and a thin band of dry prairie grass approximately 1 inch thick, tamped down before the next clay layer went on top. The grass was not there for strength. It was there to slow the wall's response to moisture change, a small buffer, a way of telling the water, not yet. He worked the same technique into the other walls as precaution, removing sections and rebuilding them in layers. It added 4 weeks to the schedule. It meant going into December still working on a structure that was supposed to be finished in October. Marta spent those weeks managing the household from the main shelter, making no comment about the schedule, asking no questions about the timeline. She brought him food at midday and left him to it. The rebuilt walls went up slowly, each layer pressed and tamped before the next was added. Elias worked with his palms as much as with tools, feeling for consistency. He developed an instinct for the right density after the first few sections, the way a baker develops a feel for dough without measuring every time. By the 3rd week of November, the rebuilt corner was holding. By the end of the month, the chamber was sealed, the stove was lit, and Elias began carrying food stores down the 7 steps. Potatoes first, then onions braided and hung, then crocks of lard, sealed with cloth and wax, then the last of the apple harvest, wrapped individually in dry grass and stacked in a wooden crate. On a Thursday evening in late November, Marta came down the steps to help him arrange the last of the stores. She was wearing her coat over her wool dress. She stopped halfway down the steps. She stood still for a moment, then descended the rest of the way. She began unwrapping the apples from their grass leaves and res-tacking them in the crate. She did not say anything for several minutes. Then she said, "It's not cold down here." He said he knew. She said, "It's actually not cold at all." He said he knew that too. She looked at the walls for a long moment. At the layered sections she could just make out in the lamplight, the alternating bands of clay and pale grass. She took off her coat. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He simply added a note to the notebook. November 22nd. Marta removed her coat. That was the data point he had been waiting for. The winter of 1887 into 1888 arrived with a force that older residents of that part of Kansas described later as a settling of accounts. The October storms had given fair warning. The December temperatures had confirmed the forecast. But January was something separate. A sustained cold that did not relent, did not warm in the afternoons the way a normal winter sometimes offered, did not break long enough to let the ground recover from one freeze before the next arrived. The lowest temperature recorded in the county seat that January was 17 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. On the open plain, where there was nothing to interrupt a wind, it was almost certainly worse. Along the ridge road near the Voss parcel, 3 families suffered significant losses. The Brower family lost their root vegetable stores when the temperature inside their above-ground cellar dropped below the threshold the structure had been built to handle. Agnes Brower discovered the damage in the second week of January when she went to retrieve turnips for dinner and found them softened by a freeze, and then thaw into a condition that was neither vegetable nor compost but something between. She stood in the doorway of the cellar for a moment, then went back inside and told her children they would be having broth. A family named Riedel, newly arrived the previous spring, had not had time to build any cold storage at all. They had trusted a neighbor's barn loft, which proved insufficient. Most of what they had stored was ruined by the third week of January. Lars Henriksen lost half a barrel of salted pork and the better part of his apple store. The brine in the pork barrel had partially frozen, expanding unevenly and cracking 2 of the barrel's staves. When he found it in the morning, the smell told him everything. He stood in the barn for a long time, calculating what the loss meant for the months still ahead. He did not go past the Voss property that week. Down the 7 clay steps, in the underground kitchen that everyone on the Ridge Road had an opinion about, the temperature stayed within a range of approximately 38 to 42 degrees Fahrenheit through the entire month of January. The potatoes did not freeze. The onions did not freeze. The lard remained solid but workable. The apples, individually wrapped in their grass sleeves, were in the same condition in January as they had been in November. Not perfect, but not lost. Elias kept the iron stove lit for warmth when he was working the chamber and let it go out at night. In the mornings, the chamber was noticeably warmer than the outside temperature. Not from the stove, which had been cold for hours, but from the walls themselves, which had absorbed heat from the previous day's fire and were releasing it slowly back into the air. He noted this in a notebook with careful precision. Stove out by 9 in the evening. Chamber at 39 degrees Fahrenheit at 6 the following morning. Outside temperature at 4 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone and clay walls were not making heat. They were refusing to give it up. He had seen the principle at work in the forge, where a properly built firebox held its temperature long after the bellows went quiet. The mass of the material was the point, not what it did when the fire was burning, but what it kept when the fire was gone. He wrote in the notebook, "The cold cannot take what the wall will not release." He thought about that sentence for a while. Then he underlined it. Lars Henriksen came to the Voss property on a Tuesday in late February. He came alone, on horseback, in the late morning. Elias was in the underground kitchen when he heard Marta greet someone at the top of the steps. He recognized a voice. He did not stop what he was doing, which was making a small repair to clay around a flue pipe, where it exited the back wall. He heard boots on the steps. Lars came down all 7 steps carefully, one hand on the clay wall, adjusting his eyes to the lamplight. He wore his good hat. He took it off when he reached the bottom step and held it in both hands in front of him. He looked at the room. He looked at the hanging onions, at the crates, at the stove, at the layered walls. He looked at the ceiling where the packed clay and grass had held through the worst winter in 6 years without so much as a hairline crack. He looked for a long time without speaking. Then he asked Elias how the stores had come through. Elias told him. He said the potatoes were 90% intact. The onions had dried normally, which was expected. The apples had some natural attrition, but no freeze loss. The lard was fine. Lars held his hat for a moment. He said he had lost the pork and most of the apples. Elias said he had heard. He said he was sorry. Lars looked at the layered wall section closest to him. He reached out and pressed his palm flat against it, the way Elias had pressed his palms flat against the earth in February 2 years earlier, looking for what the ground was willing to tell him. He said he could feel the difference. He said the clay was warmer than he expected. Elias said it was because the stove had been lit the previous evening. Lars pressed his hand against the wall again, then withdrew it. He said, "You build it in layers." Elias said he had. He took out the notebook and opened it to the cross-section drawing he had made after the first failure, the one that showed the alternating bands of clay and grass, with the depth measurements and the notes on moisture gradient. He handed it to Lars without ceremony, the way a man passes a tool to someone who might know how to use it. Lars studied the drawing for a long time. His lips moved slightly, the way they do when a man is reading something in a language he mostly knows but has to think about. He asked whether the grass compressed over time. Elias said it did, slightly, and that he had anticipated for that in the layer thickness. Lars looked at the drawing again, then back at the wall. He asked whether the same principle would work in a more conventional root cellar configuration, built into a hillside rather than dug straight down. Elias said he believed it would. He said the key was the depth in the layer construction, not the specific geometry. Lars nodded slowly. He handed the notebook back. He looked at the room one more time. Then he put his hat on, touched the brim with 2 fingers, and went back up the 7 steps without another word. Marta was waiting at the top. She had been there the whole time. She watched Lars walk back to his horse and mount. She watched him ride north toward the property, without looking back. Then she came down the steps and stood next to her father. She said, "He didn't apologize." Elias said, "No." She said, "Does that bother you?" He closed the notebook and set it on the shelf. He was quiet for a moment. He said he took off his hat. She thought about that. Then she nodded. That was enough. Lars Henriksen built a modified version of the underground kitchen in the autumn of 1888. He did not copy the design exactly. He adapted it to the slope behind his barn, where the hillside offered a more natural configuration. He used a layered clay and grass wall construction that Elias had shown him, adjusting the proportions based on his own soil, which was lighter and drained better than the Voss parcel. His wife reported that winter that the cellar held better than anything they had built before. Agnes Brower came to Elias in September that same year and asked if she could see the notebook. She sat at the table in the main shelter and read through the relevant sections carefully, asking 1 or 2 questions in a quiet voice. She did not take notes. She had a very good memory. Her own version of the structure went up in October on the north side of her kitchen garden, and though it was smaller than Elias's, it held her vegetable stores through a winter that was nearly as severe as the one before. A Czech family named Horak, who had settled 3 miles east the previous spring, heard about the underground kitchens through the community's informal conversation network, which was faster and more reliable than any newspaper. The father came to Elias in November, before the first hard freeze, and spent an afternoon asking careful questions. He had been a mason in Bohemia and understood clay in ways that went beyond Elias's experience. He modified the wall construction technique slightly, using a finer layer of dried reed instead of prairie grass, which compacted more evenly. He told Elias afterward that the principle was the same as something his grandfather had done with storage houses in Moravia. He said the word for in Czech was something Elias could not quite pronounce, but that translated approximately as, "What the earth has already decided." By the spring of 1891, there were 6 structures of varying design along the ridge road that traced their origin, directly or indirectly, to the notebook Elias had carried from Westphalia and filled in Kansas. A journalist from a county paper came through that spring, writing a piece on agricultural practices among the immigrant farming communities. The pastor recommended 3 people for him to speak with. The first name he gave was Elias Voss. The journalist came on a Friday. He was young and asked questions and wrote everything down in a small leather notebook, not unlike the one Elias carried. He asked about the clay, the layering technique, the depth, the temperature data. Elias answered everything as precisely as he could, occasionally consulting his own notebook to verify a number. At the end of the conversation, the journalist asked Elias what had made him believe the idea would work, back in those first months when no one else did. Elias thought about this for a moment. He looked out the window at the low slope where the underground kitchen sat. The entrance was modest, almost invisible, just a wooden door set into hillside, with a short chimney stub above it. Nothing about it announced what it was. He said, "The ground was already doing it. I only asked it to do it on purpose." The journalist wrote that down. Marta, who was 19 by then and ran most of the household, brought them coffee and did not stay for the conversation. But later that evening, after the journalist had gone, she asked her father what he had told him. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said it was a good answer. He opened the notebook to the last page with writing on it. He had not added a new entry in several months. He wrote the date, and then the journalist's question, and then his own answer, and then one more line that he did not read aloud. She did not ask what it said. The notebook remained in the family for many years. Later hands had added notes in the margins in English, Swedish, and Czech. Some of the additions were technical. Some were simply acknowledgments. Tried this, works, or use read, same result, or a date and a name and nothing else. The underground kitchen on the Voss property stood for more than 20 years after Elias built it. By then the technique had traveled far enough that most people who used it no longer knew where it had come from. The ground had always known. Elias had simply learned to listen. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice. Details represent a plausible reconstruction of frontier building practices of the period.